This is Gnosis of the Body, where we explore embodied wisdom in healing the mind-body split through personal stories, using Jungian depth psychology, mythology, and following collective trends, and following wisdom stories of the body. And so now I bring you back to my delicious, wonderful talk with Alex Amorosi. And trigger warning, this part's going to get a little bit more intense, the interview, because I'll be sharing my experience of somatic traumatic memory and yoga training and exploring why this is the thing that happens to people who practice yoga. And I'll start you off with a quote from The Body Keeps the Score by Bessel van der Kolk. Mainstream Western psychiatric and psychological healing traditions have paid scant attention to self-management. In contrast, the Western reliance on drugs, verbal therapies, other traditions from around the world rely on mindfulness, movement, rhythms, and actions. Aside from yoga, few of these popular non-Western healing traditions have been systematically studied for the treatment of PTSD. Okay, so there were a lot of amazing books I studied when I was at Columbia. With my Jungian professors there, having a geek fest, analyzing all of this yogic stuff that had happened to me and turning it into a myth and an archetype and there's a story and there's a collective story and I'm part of it. Whee! And I'm still being a dork, like how many years later? Like 6 years, 8 years later. And so I want to bring in this great book called The Archetype of Initiation by Robert Moore and just bring in, to illustrate for the listeners, elements, just to point them out with names that you and I know that we've already been talking about. And one is the call. The first step of the initiation on the path of initiation is the call. The hero, the heroine gets the call. And in my view and my personal experience, my call came through the body. I was burned out. I could not anymore. I was go, good at work. This is very important psychologically, being good for the parent, not showing the breakdown, being good for the society. I think the Western male definitely doesn't get to come into this space as much, because he's got to do it. I was speaking to a man a week ago. He's like, no, I didn't really like my job, but I had 2 kids and a wife, and there's not really another path than to keep going to the law firm every day. And that's the cyclical. The feminine allows for the breakdown. And I was very fortunate working for the French government, which has a nice little socialistic setup, and I could do a sabbatical. And I was allowed that time. And I wish everyone was allowed that time. But so after the call, they become the seeker. And specifically in yoga, just as you were pointing out, I think people get the call from the body. And Jung always said, the psyche itself initiates a process of renewal. So that's death and rebirth. And we have this archetype that we know as Persephone. And I picked out right about the time we were all in our own little underworld and lockdown, and I was writing my thesis, I found this brilliant other Jungian who built on the archetype of initiation. And she brought up the myth of Inanna. And the difference between Persephone and Inanna is the Sumerian version. Inanna chooses to go to the underworld. Persephone is raped. And I was called by my subconscious, speaking through the body, to go off to Spain and do this yoga teacher training. But because it's coming out of my subconscious, I didn't know what was going to happen. So I became, the seeker. I became what I called the thesis hysterical yogis. Because it's like, where all these women were like, we're going to yoga. This is great. We don't really know what's going on. Well, what's going on, my dear, is you're getting into a parasympathetic nervous state and you're relaxing for the first time. You're also breathing for the first time. And before I get into somatic traumatic memories, I'm going to do a quick segue on breath, because you said some brilliant stuff there. And it was, I couldn't actually breathe because, as anyone will know who knows their basic anatomy, the chest is tight, Your neck is thrust forward. The more we tense our neck muscles, the more we're like this on our phones, which hunches our shoulders forward, we are cutting off our breath. We're also using our back muscles in ways that restrict our diaphragm. And then what got really interesting with mine and my shoulder injury, which it took about 1.5 years of an osteopath figuring this out. They did a breath release on me. They did a bunch of work on me. And one of the reasons I left my job was I was throwing up all the time when I was coming back from these flights. So I was the press attaché for the French government tourist office. So I was on flights. And they figured out it was the flight back to America where I was the most dehydrated, where the muscles were the most shortened. And I had, blah, 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 shoulder column, muscle latissimus dorsi, jammed up, holding my diaphragm into my stomach. And the doctor, when he did the breath release, said, I don't know how you didn't throw up every time. I don't know how you've been breathing without throwing up. So I physically had an injury that was stopping me breathing. But I think collectively, everyone can't breathe deeply. Then there's the permission to breathe deeply. And then the more and more I breathed, the more and more I calmed down. And this is where we get into the touchy point. And this is where I'm going to ask you to come in and be the expert and comment on this experience, because I didn't know this was a thing when this happened to me. So I'd been in therapy for about 11 years at this point. I could definitely say this ex-boyfriend of mine was a jerk. I could say he'd been controlling. I even started to learn the language of I'd been very badly gaslit. But we were in a body scan once again one day. And Esther, I think she was doing a deeper body scan because she had also been a psychotherapist. And so she said something's going to maybe come up. And if someone has a reaction, don't touch them. Very interesting what happens here. And we get to the right upper arm. And I immediately shoot back to remembering this night where he was slamming me down in a bed, twisting the arm behind my back. And this arm twisted so far behind my back that these fingers came up behind. So this shoulder is really twisted. Now, what's interesting here is I screamed something. I started sobbing. And I said the one thing that was too fragile to say in therapy. I said, why? Why are you doing this to me? Now, this is someone I had met when I was 11 years old. I now can say we were trauma bonded because the very first time that I went to his house when we were little, I watched his father physically abuse him. So this is a cycle. This is a wounded person I know who then did this to me, who ironically also did his own healing journey through yoga. But my subconscious, therapy was not enough. I needed to release something from my body. And it led me to this practice back in the body, and it reunified me. What is this? You have, I imagine, been there for these. What is this phenomenon in our collective? Why is this a moment for us to heal?
Oh, wow. There's so much there. First of all, thanks for sharing that. I didn't know that. And I'm so sorry that happened. I think, I have theories based on my experience as a yoga teacher. I don't know precisely what happens neurologically with this. I have some ideas, but I don't know. But what I would say is, what I have found is the body is the physical roadmap of the subconscious mind. And so the subconscious mind, feels very sort of amorphous and out there and a little nebulous. And it can be to some degree, because it's like, well, where is it and how do I access it? Well, your body is physically responding to your subconscious mind. In other words, they're one and the same thing. Your subconscious mind is telling its story through the body, through your posture, through the body sensations, through where you grip, through how you tend to, find imbalance in the body. There's a lot of ways that the subconscious expresses through the body. But because it's subconscious, you can't necessarily put that masculine rational mind on it and say like, well, this right injury in my shoulder is because someone abused me. Because linearly going forward, this is a pain in your right shoulder. It is one separate thing. In the feminine understanding of the body, which yoga draws us into in many different ways, there's a holistic understanding. It's a little like what we talked about before, where you kind of come out of time and space. and you're in a bigger, more cyclical, more spherical understanding of your experience, that this space, using your example, you were in a place within yourself where you were able to step out of the linear progression and into the spherical understanding, and there was a different kind of connection that your brain or your mind could make, because you could feel the sensation, and then coming out of time into the, maybe this more right brain way of understanding, maybe more parasympathetic, all sorts of energetic theories we could go into too. You were able to say, oh yes, I remember this. I remember why this pain is here. And what's beautiful about it is your body is sitting there with that information saying, see me, see me. I always say to people, the monsters that are running after you aren't trying to hurt you. They've got the keys, man. They're trying to give you the keys to your freedom. They're like, hey, hang on, wait. I know it's tough to see this, but once you see this, once you have a key, you have a way of furthering your healing process. And I have seen this in examples similar to what you have described, with different types of physical abuse. I've seen it with, physical or sexual abuse. I've seen it with verbal, mental, or emotional abuse. I've seen it with traumatic situations or really traumatic breakups that people go through. And it's very important, that will happen in a yoga class sometimes. And I've given my teachers language of how to work with that with their students if it does arise, because you then have to become the archetypal mother of that space, to just be there with that process, because it's a process that has been trying to happen for a long time. And you can let them know that it's okay, that it's normal, that they're safe. I saw someone once going through a very, very acrimonious divorce, and he really, really broke down from it. I don't know the whole backstory of what had been going on, but I just know, and just sobbing and sobbing. And he goes, I don't know what's going on. I'm just like, your body has been holding this for a long time, and now it's ready to let it go. And the subconscious mind mapped in the body, when you've come out of your linear understanding and trying to connect A to B to C, you recognize that, oh, if I look at this from the bird's eye view, this, of course, is reminding me of a sensation I experienced that has been held here because it was not safe to release it, or I couldn't release it at the time, or I didn't have the tools to release it at the time. And now what I say to my students all the time, whether they're experiencing something extreme or not, is, I usually use a big exhale to release the energy from the body. I'm like, let that go, because your body senses an opportunity here. Your body is sensing an opportunity to alleviate you of that weight and that stress, and it can move out. So that's my 2 cents on what happened. But there can be a lot of different things that are going on too, based on the experience and where it's being held and how it's being released as well.
Yeah, it was very much the space. So once again, my teacher, it had been many weeks at that point. I felt safe. I felt safe in the group. It was a group of females. She had given the permission for it. I'd been moved into parasympathetic nervous states repeatedly. And something very interesting happened, which goes back actually to the myth of Inanna, and then another archetype that we haven't quite brought in, which is the wounded healer. And Esther had said, don't touch people. But one of my classmates disobeyed her because I was howling. And she just came and she touched me and she sat with me. And in the myth of Inanna, something that's very different and weird from the Persephone myth is she has a dark sister who's the queen of the underworld. Inanna is the queen of heaven. Her girdle, she's now sort of been broken up in the Greek pantheon into Venus and Hera and a couple other goddesses. She's been divided, but she's the queen of heaven. She makes love loudly and proudly. Her girdle is the stars and the moon. And it's, again, a moon myth, the 3 days that she's gone to the underworld. We don't have a moon. No one is making love. The animals aren't breeding. Nothing's growing. We've got problems on Earth because she's gone down to see her sister. And one part of the myth that is always very interesting to people exploring the myth is at one point her sister's going into labor. And they haven't mentioned that her sister's pregnant, but all of a sudden they're like, and then her sister, Rishkagal, is moaning with the pains of labor. And at this point, Anana's been gone, and she left word up in the upper world, like, if I don't come back, guys, send. So I think Air has come down after her, and Neki. And the two divine beings that need to get Anana out, what do? They go sit with Erishkigal in her birth pains, and they give her empathy, and they stay with her through the birth. And this classmate just came and touched me and held me. And we're back to that feminine idea of just being held. And that's what the psychotherapist does for you, or the psychoanalyst. They just hold you through the experience. And then you're describing how you as a teacher have held people through this, been that presence there. And then you're teaching your teachers to do that. And that brings back this quote that, so Robert Moore worked with gangs. He worked with disaffected youth in Chicago. He was a minister. And so I'm just going to read this little quote from him, talking about how we're missing ritual and we're missing elders. And he said, the ritual elders can guide people through the ritual steps. A, the change, the life crisis. B, the sacred space and time for needed reorganization. And then C, the newly transformed personal and social world. So that's archetype of initiation.
Oh my God. Yes. Sorry, I just got really excited about that because, the ones that keeps coming to mind for me because I'm a nerd is Star Wars, right? Luke Skywalker. This is a very Luke Skywalker. Obi-Wan Kenobi is the wise, the elder who holds space for him, and anyways, let me back up a little bit because I think you're hitting on something really important here. The initiation process, it's interesting. So as a male yoga teacher, and there are definitely more women yoga teachers than men, but I tend to have more guys that will come to my class. And still, I would say the predominantly women are in my class. I think for whatever reason, we could go into that, but I've had a lot of guys come to my class over the years. And sometimes they come because someone brings them. Sometimes they come on their own. But I think that all of us, whether we're women or men, are seeking a connection back to that space of, in other words, we're descending down to see Erishkigal. We don't realize that that's what we're doing. But what I've noticed with the guys that I've worked with over the years is whether they're gay or straight, I happen to be a gay man, but whether they're gay or they're straight, there's a recognition that what they've been doing hasn't been working. Their way of being, their way of trying to assert isn't working, and there's something out of whack. And what I'll notice is, this to me is the call. There's something that's just off. There's something that just doesn't feel right within them, and they can't explain it. And then they'll come and we'll work through in class, and I've done this with college students and teams and whatever. We've worked through this as well, where there's I don't know why I'm here, I just know that I'm here. And I know I'm in a yoga class for a reason. And I've come to your yoga class for a reason because, people will pick a yoga teacher very much based on who they feel safe with and how they feel safe. Because it's so vulnerable to be in a yoga class and be creating all these shapes, things falling and feeling vulnerable in so many ways. What I notice is that call oftentimes, whether it's women or men, can be a big life transition or a big thing that happens. Or sometimes it's just a sense of something's not right. Something's not working anymore. I think of the beginning of the Divine Comedy, where, Dante says in the beginning of the Divine Comedy, in the middle of our lives, I found myself in a dark wood that the way forward was unclear. And that is the beginning of I'm lost. I don't know where I am. I don't know where to go. Now, here's where I think this is really interesting. So if you take this into astrology, I think this is talking a lot about the Saturn return. This is the second Saturn return that happens around the age of 58 or 60, when Saturn returns for the second time to the same place in the zodiac it was when you were born. So it's about a 29.5-year orbital cycle. And what I talk to my clients who are going through that transition is the initiation into being the elder and into being the, was it the wisdom keeper you were saying? It was the elder and the...
Ritual elder was the word that he...
Ritual elder, yeah. So there's a sense where during these Saturn returns, your identity for the past 30 years is somehow stripped away and you're initiated into a new form of life. The first one happens around 30. We're initiated into the sort of active career, family-focused part of our life. If that's what we choose to do, it can happen in a lot of different ways. By 60, we're moving more towards the archetypal grandparent, which is The wisdom keeper, in a highest sense, the elder is someone who is no longer focused exclusively on their nuclear family, but is available for the community, is available to bestow their wisdom and what they have learned, if we as younger people are wise enough to accept that advice, which sometimes we're not. But sometimes just like, no, I understand. I remember when I was 20, I was like, well, I get this. I'm 20. I don't need to do any more. Like, I understand meditation. I'm 20 years old. What do I need to know? I got this. But all this to say that there's a process through which this feeling lost, or this feeling unsure, or this knowledge that what I'm doing isn't quite working, can be just kind of like, the Matrix, they call it the splinter in the mind, that initiates us, whether it's a big Saturn return towards being a ritual elder, whether it's becoming a parent, whether it's becoming a caregiver to an aging parent maybe, or another job, or whatever it is, getting into a long-term relationship and initiating yourself into that partnership. There's something where we're resolving a dissonance in our energy field. We're resolving there's something that's asking me to bust forward here and grow. But in order to do that, I have to release and let go of what has been. And that we can intellectually sit here and talk about, but is a challenging process you go through. And a lot of times what I think yoga does is it gives the somatic element, which is often missing, which yoga is like, this isn't just happening on the level of your mind that you can talk about. There's a physical feeling to that process. There's a physical resolution that is happening. And I always tell my students, follow the trail of relief. That's the resolution that's coming together little by little, whether it's in one class or it's a span of many years. And there's a space where, and I saw this years ago with some of the guys that I would work with, for the first time, they looked calm. They weren't trying to achieve. They weren't trying to make it. They weren't trying to provide. They weren't trying to do all the things that they were supposed to do. They were just lying on their back in a yoga studio, breathing. And you could see in them too, there was that sense of, there was a beginning of a resolution of that dissonance. And I just think of it because I was thinking of those guys because I remember seeing it very clearly with them, but I've seen it with, in some way, shape, or form, probably all my students over the years, that same process. It's one way, shape, or form. Yeah.
Yeah. And one thing that's, really, really, like, it might seem so obvious that I don't want to let it go by is we're talking about cycles. And again, how cycles are not allowed in our culture. They're not recognized. I now live in Europe. I worked for a European government as an employer for years, but Americans don't have vacation. Europeans have vacation. So there is a recognition of time to recharge, time to go back to your source again. And then also within cycles, just as you were pointing out, using the astrological example, there is a marking of passage of time. And what Robert Moore was talking about in his work with teenagers was what we are missing as a culture. And this is something Jung pointed out, is we miss ritual. We miss markings of passages of time. He was talking about we don't have, markings of time passage and rites of passage. That's the word I'm looking for teenagers. We definitely don't have it for 58-year-olds. We definitely don't have it. You used the example, we've been talking father, mother. You and I do not have children. What's our marker of our cycle? Who are we in the culture? And I think that's probably why you and I are seekers, because wow, we've accumulated a lot of experience and wisdom, but we don't fit into the heteronormative, roles of, so who are we giving this knowledge to? You're giving it to your students and your clients. I'm giving it to my clients when I'm doing somatic healing or sexology. And it's, who are you in the culture? And we don't give roles for those 58-year-olds. We don't give roles for, you're like, you're still working, you're pre-retirement. And when you're retired, you're dead to the culture. You're dead to the culture, which is horrible. When you're a teenager, your parents are so overwhelmed with their work, especially if they're a single parent, that you're off on your phone because they can't handle you at the end of the workday, and you don't even know how to communicate with them. So there's no communication going on. And Robert Moore would talk about how with no rituals, where there is, there's a relation space there. And in yoga and in these spaces, I'm entering into relation with women in their 50s They were guiding me through these steps. They knew what to do. They were there for me. They had a role for me. And yoga teacher has created an age differential, not always, but a role. And there's a role that doesn't exist for teenagers anymore in this day. And so Robert Moore was talking about how people who got involved with gangs were looking for rites of passage. They were looking for ritual things.
Exactly. And, in the feminine archetype, the idea of, which are related to the three phases of the moon, the new, the full, and the balsamic moon, there's the maiden, the new moon, the mother, the full moon, and the crone, the balsamic moon. There's the phases of life. And for women, physiologically, with the onset of menses and then the onset of menopause, there are physiological markers of these stages of transition, which we don't honor either. And I'm not going to sit here and mansplain about any of these things. So I just want to be careful, very careful of that. But that there's a cycle in that, a literal cycle in that. That's the feminine involved. And I think for whether we're women or men, like you said, the ability to have a wise older figure, an Obi-Wan Kenobi type figure that can hold the space, be aware of where your pitfalls are, guide you, and hone your re-emerging identity. We do miss that quite a bit. And we do miss, and I think ritual, I want to get back to the idea of ritual for a second, because I think it's so important. We've gotten away from the tangible ceremony and ritual that gives not only those rites of passage meaning, but that gives our lives meaning. And that when we learn how to create, and I work with some of my coaching clients, I'll work with them on creating a ritual around an element, like an earth ritual or a water ritual or a fire ritual or something around, whatever's happening. So that it's not only that we intellectually understand this has ended, this is beginning. It's that we show our bodies, our subconscious, our more abstract perceptions. We give it a tangible closure, and we give it a tangible new beginning. And those reenactments, there are all sorts of shamanic initiations that reenact certain stages of that process. Or there are all kinds of, even in yoga, yoga teacher training, like you were saying, there's an understanding that I'm being called to not just understand this on the level of my intellect. I'm being called to embody this, and we embody those understandings through ritual, through setting up an altar, through teaching a yoga class, through, working with a stick of incense, or working with some, maybe even a more involved ceremony that comes from a tradition. Because that shows our subconscious, our body, our energy system, that this particular part of life has ended and this new part of life is beginning. And I think that, coming full circle to what we were talking about with yoga studios, I think that is part of, I'm learning from this conversation, what yoga provides in our culture now is that it provides a place for ritual. It provides a place for embodiment. And the initiation is, like I saw with the MIT crew team when I would teach these guys, 19, 20-year-old kids, guys who would come in for yoga, they were even seeking, their coach was making them do this. They weren't like, coming and being like, yeah, we're all gung-ho in yoga. But when they would leave class, they would all look like changed. And I thought, even this process of how the universe has orchestrated this has orchestrated an initiation for you. And I can be here for you in this process to hold the space of that and hone it. And hold space so that it doesn't feel out of control. Because, think about those young men who were joining the gangs, as the researcher was talking about, right? That they're looking for somebody to hold space for forces that are erupting from within them that they don't know how to control. And they're terrified of them. They're going into the underworld, encountering all of these spaces that feel compulsive or drawing in this way or that way. And looking for someone to give it some kind of guidance, some kind of space in which that can flourish and be honed into a space where they eventually, like we were talking about with the sun and the moon before, can hold it themselves. They can hold that energy themselves without needing the external Obi-Wan Kenobi figure.
Yeah. And what I love about you saying that there are men coming to your classes is that you are a man who has learned to hold the feminine space. You are embodying and holding the feminine space. And that is so hard for men in our culture to get in contact with. And something that, one of my Jungian professor said this and just like my head exploded. I was like, that's it. He was teaching us in Columbia University, Dr. Mark Curris, who trained with Hillman. As he said, he's like, you have been laid hands upon. I'm like, I am in direct lineage of Hillman. Like, talk about like a ritual geekdom. Like I am in the lineage of ritual geekdom of Jung. But he said, Jung said, what is missing in the religion will come out in the culture. And what is missing is the feminine. The goddess has been relegated to just being the Holy Spirit. The Trinity does not work because we need to come to a quaternity. The body is out of it. And then he started talking about priestesses. And, women go to festivals and dress up as priestesses. We call each other goddess. What does that really mean? And I was like, it's coming out in the culture what we're looking for. And then I thought, if I was an alien and I landed on a Saturday morning in a yoga studio, and I'm watching, once again, probably a female, probably quite beautiful, very in her body because she's wearing, tight clothing. So we're seeing her bodily curves. We're seeing her body for all it is. If it is a male like yourself, he is there preaching about the body. So just teaching about the body, that is the feminine space. And then everyone's moving in unison to what this person says and does. As an alien, because my teacher said, what do you see in the symbol? What do you see in the symbol? And I just thought about that symbol of if you walked into a yoga class from another planet, you'd think they're practicing some weird religion. This is a priestess of some kind. And even as a male yoga teacher, you are a priestess because you're embodying the feminine in a feminine wisdom space, knowledge coming out of the body. So glad you agree with me. Thanks.
Yeah, no, I do.
Okay, thank you. And when he said, what is missing in the religion will be supplied by the culture because it's going to come out of the collective unconscious. And I was like, oh, yeah. But before we wrap up here, I'm gonna put you on the spot a little bit as an astrologer, but I'm going to ask you to speak collective, like archetypal symbol for everyone. So if we have this call from the subconscious coming through the body, we're being called to heal. We're being called to feel. We're being called to come back into sensation. We're doing it through ritual practice. Let's also just note the sun salutation is a ritual. It's a ritual where we end in death, in corpse pose. What is going on collectively now for us in the archetypes? So you can't cheating. You can't use planets because for people who don't speak astrology, we got to translate. What's going on in the culture that we're being called to heal, to come into these spaces where I am one of many people having those somatic traumatic memories and we're healing together? What is that?
That's a really amazing question, and I'm putting together a couple of ideas that are kind of I'm intuiting. One is that we are, as a collective, let's put it in a more general sense, the goddess is rising. The feminine energy is reasserting itself and more organically growing up into us again. And we begin to feel the call of the goddess. The call to go to a yoga class and embody something is a call of the goddess. The call to heal a wound, to nurture, to be that archetypal holding of the baby's head on the chest. That is the call of the goddess. We are in a variety of ways welcoming the goddess back into our culture. Now, there's a lot of resistance to that. There's a lot of fear around it. There's a lot of complicated emotional reactions to it because we are beginning to move into a paradigm over the next 100 years or so, maybe a couple hundred years, that is much less about authoritative spirituality, about someone telling you, this is what happened, this is what's going on, and I expect you to supplicate yourself before that. We're moving into a much more horizontal understanding of spirituality where each of us, you hear it in modern spiritual language, right, Katherine, of this idea of everybody has their own connection to spirit. Everybody has their own spirituality. No one can tell you what that is for you. Those are very, more or less pretty new ideas. We've used to go with the idea of the priest and the parishioner. We used to go with the idea of the guru and the disciple. That line is no longer as pronounced as it used to be. And what we're coming into is a more feminine understanding in the Aquarian age. So we're moving from the Piscean age, that's been basically from about the beginning of the Common Era up until now. The Aquarian age, which Pisces is a little bit more about the transcendence and opening to transcendence, but being channeled through someone or supplicating yourself before someone who is doing the transcendent work for you, in a sense, and bringing that into incarnation. Aquarius, where we're moving towards, is much more the archetype of the highly individual person who likes to be in community with other very individual people, and a horizontal understanding of we're all equal as humans. And so our spirituality is beginning to reflect that. And that, I believe, even though Aquarius is not a feminine sign, it's a masculine sign, is the coming of the goddess, the reemergence of the goddess, because there's an equality. The masculine is hierarchical. Again, there's nothing wrong with it. It can get out of balance, but it's just part of the archetypes. The feminine is horizontal. And we're in relationship and community. And we're beginning to realize, and I think, if we get really out, big into the bigger philosophical questions, what we're encountering now as humanity cannot be handled individually. It has to be handled collectively, communally. And, we require that more feminine understanding of interrelatedness. And as one of my teachers says, right relationship. And that doesn't mean we lose our individuality. We just recognize we don't have to carry the burden of having to do everything ourselves and make everything happen ourselves, which is why yoga, my thought about this in conclusion is that yoga is so important and classes are so important and teacher training is particularly important because they're groups, they're communities. We're coming together in a common purpose to understand our own individual spiritual path with other people who are doing the same thing. Whether it's in resonance in a class, because you're not doing a lot of talking usually in a class, or in a teacher training where there is a more of a talking interaction with other people there. That's where I think yoga's specific role is happening. But there are many other ways that that's happening now, even just happening in the last 4 or 5 years.
Yeah, I love that. I had that once put to me by I was trying to not speak astrology because I feel like it always alienates people who don't understand that. And I
can't help myself.
No. It's me too. But this actually I call him my Jungian astrologer who I adore. He said, no, in the age of Pisces, it was the age of the guru. It was the age of Jesus. In the age of Aquarius, everyone's the guru. Everyone's the guru. Everyone's their own guru. I love that. But I love that we've also brought back in the teacher and the space for the older teacher, and for femininity being its own femininity, for not being weakness, for being something that men need in their lives. Men need to be held. Men need a space for breakdown and for healing. Just exactly like I was sharing, in my experience of abuse, it was not a mean, evil, bad man. It was a hurt little boy who grew up into a hurting man. We are all one on top of the other in these cycles. And so that's why we have to come into the feminine space of being vulnerable together, being ready to drop into those parasympathetic nervous states, to be held and to hold each other, which is so opposite from the idea of warring, competing, better than, look at me, don't look at them. You're nothing, I'm everything. It's like, no, can we please get into the V word, vulnerable, together?
Can I add one more point on that, Katherine, just because you brought it up? I think it's really helpful, especially for the guys I used to teach years ago who would come to my classes. And so as far as I know, they were all straight. I don't know that for a fact, but I'm pretty sure, I'm pretty sure. And what I noticed was when they would come to my class, there was an ease they had with me as a gay man, because they were very secure with themselves. There was an ease they had that I was always kind of puzzled by, because as a gay man, I had learned growing up to fear straight men, because they're the ones who are going to, make fun of me, abuse me, whatever it is. I'm scared of the feminine part of me is very scared to be around that. And what I began to realize over time, and as I thought about it, was these guys felt a lot of relief around me because they didn't have to be the bro. They didn't have to be relegated to the very specific topics that they're supposed to speak about in order to express the masculine side and the masculine side only. They could relax because I didn't care. I'm like, you can just be whoever you are. And what I would notice was, regardless of sexual orientation or gender identity or whatever, that level of experience, these guys were yearning to just express their whole self, which embodies also the goddess. And so it's whether it's men or it's women, we're all looking, or people who are, non-binary or gender neutral, these forces of archetype are seeking expression. And I think right now it's the force of the archetype of the feminine that is seeking expression and seeking safe places to do that.
Beautiful. Beautiful. That was just like, it's just like plaster that on a wall. That was beautifully said. I love that. Thank you. Thank you so much for sharing that. Gosh, I feel like we could keep doing this forever, but we need to draw this to a close. So I hope you'll come back because I feel like we could jazz on this a lot more.
Absolutely. I had a great time talking about this. Thank you so much for having me.
Oh, thank you so much. And I'm just going to close out with this quote that has come back to me and I've found that is so what we've been speaking about. And it's Jung did a seminar about Nietzsche's Zarathustra in 1934 and 1939. And so this quote is from there. We should return to the body in order to create spirit again. Without body, there is no spirit, because spirit is a volatile substance of the body.
You started out getting me teary and you're leaving me ending teary. It's beautiful. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I can't wait to do this again. Alex Amorosi, everyone. I'm going to put all the links down in the linksies and all the places, but he is a healer and astrologer based in Boston, Massachusetts, alexamorosi.com. Look him up, work with him. I highly recommend it.
Thank you, Katherine. Such a joy to be here with you.